Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Robert L. Kelly, a professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming, and the author of a book that I absolutely love. It's called The Fifth Beginning. And can you recite the subtitle for us?
What 6 million years of human history can tell us about our future.
So, audience, we have half an hour to find out what 6 million years of human history can teach us. But first, let's talk a little bit about your background. You're the past president of the American Society of Archaeology.
The Society for American Archaeology.
Yes, that's right. Author of over 100 books, papers, articles, all that. You have come to Santa Fe as a guest for the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, and you recently gave a talk for them that I was absolutely enthralled by. So before we launch into what we have to learn from all this history, as an archaeologist, would you tell us, in case people don't really understand, what is archaeology? And you call yourself a dirt archaeologist. What is that?
Well, a dirt archaeologist is someone who spends as much time as possible outdoors, excavating sites and recovering information about the past, because that's what archaeologists do. We study the past, and specifically the human past. We don't do dinosaurs, for example.
Right. You have jokingly called, I don't know, maybe seriously, that archaeologists are the Cowboys of Science. What do you mean by that?
This is a famous bumper sticker that most archaeologists will have seen at some point. Archaeology is it's a difficult field. In some ways, it's more difficult than rocket science. It's very difficult for us to test our ideas and know whether we're right or not. The rocket scientist knows. I mean, the rocket goes up or it doesn't. And archaeologists, it's really rather difficult for us to know exactly what happened in the past. We can reconstruct it with scientific techniques, but oftentimes we have to play a little faster and looser with our data than for example, some statisticians would like to see us do.
One of the things they say about is that archaeologists think from things.
That's right.
So what do you have to work with?
Well, archaeologists work with the things that we dig up: broken pots, broken arrowheads, crumbled walls, the broken remains of animal bones that were food remains, burnt plant remains, just all sorts of scraps of little things. And that's the only information we have with which to reconstruct and understand the past, things.
Hence the saying, it's not what you find, it's what you find out.
My mentor is famous.
Oh, that was your mentor's
quote. My mentor,
quote.
David,
I love
David
that.
Hurst Thomas, yeah.
So we'll do two more quotes because this is how we'll launch into what we learned from the past about the future. Winston Churchill, the longer you look back, the longer you can look back, the further you can look forward.
Right. And this really explains why we do archaeology. I mean, ultimately, we want to study the past in order to know something about the future, or to know something about what direction the future will take, or what direction the future ought to take.
The other thing is the inscription from King Tut's tomb, which says, "I have seen yesterday, I know tomorrow."
Yeah, yeah.
Which brings us to the premise for your book. This is a short book, beautifully written, very clearly written.
Thank you.
And it is your mission, in a way, that you've studied the past, and you have this idea about the future that you want to present to us.
Mm-hmm. So what I wanted to do with the book was take the charge that archaeologists give themselves very seriously. What does the past have to say about the future? And to do that, I decided to take the real strength of archaeology. Because archaeology, it's difficult for us to reconstruct in a lot of detail the things that happened in the past. But the overall picture, the big picture, the biggest of big pictures of human history, we can really see that very, very clearly. And when we step back, in a sense, and look at all of human history, all 6 million years of it, one of the things we notice is that there have been 4 times in those 6 million years when humanity went through a rather dramatic change in the way that it was organized, in really the basic nature of human life. And these 4 times were the beginning of technology, about 3.3 million years ago.
And those we see in the Stone Age tools.
All of these things are marked by things.
Yeah, okay.
That's all we have to work with.
Uh-huh.
And we recognize them because there's a dramatic change in the kinds of things or where things are distributed across the face of the planet. A significant change in the kinds of things we find and how they're parsed out across the planet. The first of those is technology, 3.3 million years ago. It's simple stone tools, but it laid the foundation for a basic human adaptation, which is things, objects, tools. The second change, which happens somewhere between 250,000 years ago, 200,000 to 50,000 years ago, is the beginning of human culture, the capacity to create a symbolic construction of the world that we live in, to see it as something other than a simple, straightforward material set of facts. This is the beginning of our capacity to tell stories, to tell myths, to have legends. It's the beginning of our ability to talk about another world, a world where we go after we die. It's the beginning of our ability to use analogies, metaphors, similes, to tell lies. The third beginning is the origins of agriculture. And this occurs at various places in the world starting about 12,000 years ago. And this is a shift from a hunting and gathering way of life to an agricultural way of life. It's a shift from a highly nomadic way of life to a very sedentary way of life, with a dramatic change in the construction of houses, in the villages, in wells, in storehouses, and in domesticated plants, corn, rice, wheat, millet. These were all plants that didn't exist until starting about 12,000 years ago. And then they were spread over various parts of the planet beyond the range of their wild ancestors. The fourth beginning is the origin of what anthropologists call the state. And this starts about 5,000 years ago and occurs in various places in the world at different times. But it's the appearance of a political and social organization that entails a hierarchical structure, with very few individuals at the top controlling the lives of the majority of people at the bottom.
Is it accelerating? It seems like these earlier phases are much longer and the latter are shorter.
It does appear to be accelerating, yes.
What are the changes in the human signature now that drew you to posit the theory that we are at the fifth beginning?
I had to think about this from the perspective of archaeologists 10,000 years in the future.
In the future.
When they look back on our time, which will be ancient to them, they're going to look and ask whether there's been any other dramatic change in the human signature since the origins of states with their pyramids and walled cities and so on. And I think the answer is yes, and that probably begins about AD 1500. It's the period of globalization. It's the appearance of huge numbers of shipwrecks on the bottom of the ocean. It's the appearance of material things on the moon and on Mars. It's the appearance of technology to move goods and people around the world quickly. It's the appearance of a whole range of technology and goods which indicate that the world is knit together in a very tight fashion, at least economically. Movements of goods from one place to every place else in the world.
Another dramatic increase in the literal size of man's footprints are the size of the cities and the very size of the buildings in the cities.
The buildings are 7 times bigger than the biggest building in prehistory of Khufu's pyramid in Egypt. The size of our trash dumps are some of the biggest things that humanity has ever created.
Well, what is that trash dump in New York? What's the name of that?
The Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island, where the World Trade Center was interred.
And that's one of the biggest structures, it's a trash dump.
It's a trash dump is one of the world's biggest humanly made structures. Yes.
And then that gyre, the Texas-sized trash,
in
the middle of the Pacific.
In the middle of the Pacific, yes.
Well, I mean, it really brings me up short to think that, and when I look around, I see indeed it's true that trash is one of the signifiers of our age right now. And
absolutely.
On a very perilous level, in that the nuclear development that we've done has a deleterious byproduct of trash that we can't do anything with for 100,000 years.
Yes.
This radioactive waste is going. So if we're manufacturing trash that now we cannot possibly dispose of, I mean, it is a real heads up. But I don't want to take you away from there because there's so much to talk about in our little time together. So there are a couple of processes at work today that you really focus on.
What I do in the book for each of those 4 beginnings is look at what were the processes at work that eventually brought humanity to a tipping point. And I use that as an object lesson to think about what processes are happening today that could also, again, be bringing humanity to a 5th tipping point, a 5th beginning. And I think that there's 3 at work, three major ones at work. One is the cost of war, and a second is the nature of global capitalism, and the third is the cultural effects of globalization. The war has many people think that the arms race is a 20th century phenomenon. It's not. It's been going on for 5,000 years, really since the 4th beginning. And the cost has simply been going up and up and up. And the capacity of the weaponry, of course, has been going up and up and up. And in a sense, nuclear weapons were really the end point. You can't attack a nation that has nuclear weapons. And all they really need is the threat to use one. And yet we continue to build up our more conventional weaponry, and because it's an escalating process, it's costing more and more and more. We now spend more than 50% of our discretionary federal budget on the military. This just can't go on forever. We need that money for other things.
We're speaking today with Dr. Robert Kelly, author of the book, The Fifth Beginning. We're just outlining now the 3 of the elements, the processes at work today that might define this. Mm-hmm. One thing that you say about the cost of war going up, because we've got aircraft carriers and battleships that are in the billions, and not to mention some airplanes that are in the billions. Mm-hmm. But because of that, and because it's 50% of our income, we can't afford to do health care for everyone. The cost of war has consumed so much of our resources. So what are the other processes at work?
The second process is the global nature of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic form that operates really by always looking for cheap labor. And this has been a process that's been moving across the globe. We keep moving labor to the cheaper and cheaper markets. That's why so much manufacturing in the U.S. has moved overseas. That's the cheaper market. That's how you maximize profit. That's what makes capitalism function. But the world is finite. There's an end to geography. And the last major landmass to be penetrated fully by capitalism is Africa. And once Africa is fully penetrated by capitalism, there'll really be no more cheap labor left on the planet. Because the advantage of capitalism is it tends to lift the living standards wherever it moves. So this is a good thing. But it also makes labor more expensive. So production seeks to move its labor to other places. Africa is the major landmass, the last major landmass to be penetrated by capitalism. Once it's complete there'll be no cheap labor left on the planet. Now, we already see what's happening. They're going to go to artificial intelligence and robotics to replace more workers. Well, other economists have asked the question, what do you do in a world where labor isn't needed? How do people get money to buy the products that are being manufactured cheaply by factories with no workers? It's a bit of a paradox. I don't have an answer, but there are many economists who are thinking about how are we going to structure a post-capitalist economy.
And the third process, the globalization of culture.
The globalization of culture is resulting partly from this process of capitalism, but also from the process of war. For those two reasons, people are moving around the globe in ways that they've never moved before. We now have large communities of Somalis living in Minnesota, of all places, and this process isn't going to stop anytime soon. It's going to keep going, and it's bringing people of very different cultures next to one another. This has two effects. For some people, they're very, very, very uncomfortable if their neighbors are of a different culture than they are. It's just upsetting. For an anthropologist, this is hard to understand because anthropologists are really attracted to those kinds of differences. But for many people, it is upsetting. They feel like their world is out of balance. They don't know what's going on when there are different people living next door to them. The result of this is nations fracturing, breaking up. The Catalonians wanting to pull away from Spain, the Scottish wanting to break away from Britain, the Tyroleans want to break away from Italy. This is going on all over the world, that people are trying to put up boundaries and make their home homogeneous. It won't work. It won't happen. The economic processes at work are simply too powerful. The other process that's happening at the same time and for the same reason is producing the complete opposite result, and that is a level of global culture that everyone in the world can participate in. This is especially sports and music and television and film. This is creating a culture that everyone in the world knows and understands and shares with everyone else. The nature of the global communication system has also made it possible for us to have enormous empathy with people elsewhere in the world. This is why Doctors Without Borders feels that they have to go to the dangerous places in the world where people are hurting because, in their opinion, in their cultural view, those are their neighbors. And we help our neighbors. It doesn't matter if they're down the street or on the other side of the planet. You help your neighbors. More and more people are coming into that cultural frame of mind. Yes, they may be very different people, have very different customs. They're still our neighbors, They have to be helped. This is the good part of globalization, this construction of basically laying the cultural foundation for global citizenship.
But unfortunately, what we see in this country right now with this current administration is dismemberment of the State Department and the system of diplomacy, which treats all nations as equal and has relationships with each nation. The rise of trade agreements where corporations are favored over nations and individuals. And there's like the disparity between the two is so frightening. So you say that we can either do this transition the easy way or the hard way. And would you explain that a little bit and then talk about what we can do about it? So choose the hard way or the easy way first.
Well, the easy way would be to see the direction that the world is going. It's completely knit together economically. There's simply no escape from that. We need the global food network, as one example, to feed 7.5 billion people on the planet. Our choice is that or starvation, and nobody wants starvation. So the world is knit together in an economic fashion that's inescapable, and that's not going to stop. We simply can't put up borders and say we will be self-sufficient. That's just not going to work. So the easy way would be to recognize that economic knitting together of the world really demands an almost governmental knitting together of the world. And we've already made stabs at it. The United Nations is an effort at it. It has its problems, but it was recognized that after World War II we needed to do this. So the easy way would be to recognize where it is that we really ought to go. Global cooperation, global unity, what I like to call global self-governance. Yeah. That's the easy way, is to just recognize
One
that
other
that's going to
aspect
go.
of the easy way that you've talked about is environmental remediation, reconstruction, and sustainability, instead of extractive and using up everything around us, to actually find a way where we can renew it and all these resources can keep providing to us the fish in the sea, water, minerals, all of that. So that's the lovely easy way. And yet it seems like we might be heading toward the hard way. Describe the hard way.
Well, the hard way it is the sense that in order for a country to be successful, and this is not limited to the United States, I mean, there are other nations that feel the same way, the only way that they can be successful is if they're on top. If they're on top and they're the ones who are controlling everything else. That's what many nations are simply trying to do now by breaking away. Britain wants to break away, will apparently break away from the European Union, because there's a sense that they can't do what they want to do. They can't be who they want to be unless they completely cut ties with the European Union. But any economist can tell you they can't cut the ties with the European Union. They can't.
So these painful structural changes in the hard way are also exacerbated by the rampages of climate change over which we have no control. And then a certain bellicose element that has just got World War III in their sights. So I myself would prefer the easy way. And so we don't have much time left. If we can choose a world with enough for everyone, which suddenly is a much more egalitarian way, how can we go about do that? And how can we make our institutions change? You had spoken earlier in your speech about how in Wall Street, the movie Greed is Good, that was a value. We could change that value to greed is not good and reward people who do kind, generous, sharing, altruistic things. So we only have 2 minutes left. Please tell my audience what to think about and what to do?
I think any movement to remove ourselves from cooperative, unifying structures with the rest of the world is the wrong way to go. Trade agreements, UNESCO, the Paris Accord, these global agreements where we agree to work cooperatively to achieve a goal that will benefit everyone in the world are the things that we ought to be involved in, that we really have to be involved in. We might think that breaking away from them is going to benefit us in the long term. It will actually harm us.
One thing that our audience can do is read your book. It's called The Fifth Beginning, What 6 Million Years of Human History Can Tell Us About Our Future. It's a really fascinating perspective. It's very easy to read. It's very well written. And so this gives some insight, and for me, it nourishes the optimistic part of me. You dedicated it to your dad, an optimistic man.
Mm-hmm.
Give us more hope for us, optimism.
I take an optimistic approach in the book because other books about the future are pessimistic, and they lead to inaction. They give you the sense there's no hope. There's nothing we can do. There is hope. There are things we can do with our votes, with our own individual day-to-day actions, and that gives me some cautious hope for the future.
Well, our guest today is Dr. Robert Kelly, author of The Fifth Beginning. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next time.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.